Tidepools, Howard, look, thank you so much for joining me. It's great to see you and congratulations.
Oh, thank you so much, Stacey. It's so great to see you too. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, you got it. I'm so excited to talk to you. I don't know if you remember, but the day in 2018, I believe, when you announced that Tidepool would be shepherding this through the FDA, I was able to jump on and interview you that day. We were together out in
I
California at a conference.
100% remember that. Yeah, we were at Amy Tenderach's conference and we were in the lobby of a building at the UCSF Medical Center. Yeah,
Absolutely.
absolutely.
So, a lot to talk about between then and now.
Yes,
Let me just
a
jump right
few
in.
things have happened.
A few things, a little progress. Okay, I have what I'd like to do here is talk nuts and bolts to start with, and then kind of at the end talk more about really the ideas and a lot of philosophy behind what had happened here. This is pretty monumental in my
Sure.
opinion. So, what did the FDA approve?
Well, on Monday evening, we learned that the FDA had approved our 510(k) submission for Tidepool Loop. 510(k) submission is a way that a company or what the FDA calls a sponsor says, hey, we have a device and we would like you to review it for safety, for efficacy, for cybersecurity, for usability, for clinical effectiveness, and make sure that it meets what the FDA calls substantial equivalence, meaning does it do everything and work the way the previous predicate device worked. In our case, the predicate device was Tandem's Control IQ system.
Hmm.
And so they were the predicate device for our submission. So we had to show line by line, basically, here is the intended use for the Control IQ. Here's the intended use for Tidepool Loop. Here is the clinical effectiveness of Loop. Here's how that compares to the clinical effectiveness for Control IQ. And so we did that with our 510(k) submission, which we sent to the FDA back in December of 2020. And fast forward to January 23rd, Monday of 2023, the FDA said, yes, Tidepool, we agree with you that Tidepool Loop is substantially equivalent, and we are now clearing you. We are issuing you a clearance letter, which means you may now market and tell the world about your product. So that's what we learned on Monday.
Got it. We have done many episodes with you explaining a lot about what Tidepool Loop is. I don't want to rehash everything here, but what
Sure.
does happen next? Obviously, I can't go to the App Store and grab this today, but
Not quite yet.
when it's released,
Yes.
what happens? How do people access it? How does it work in a practical sense?
Yeah, in a very practical sense, what we have done is we've taken what was known as Loop, or we call it DIY or do it yourself Loop. So we started with that source code, made a bunch of improvements to it, ran it through our regulatory quality system and all of the processes that go along with that. And we have now created a built version of Tidepool Loop. And eventually, users will be able, people living with diabetes will be able to go to the App Store. And just like with any other app, you'll be able to just download Tidepool Loop. It will require a prescription, and people will get a prescription from their healthcare provider. The healthcare provider will log into Tidepool's prescription portal and working with the person living with diabetes, come up with the initial set of settings, things that we're all used to, like carb ratio and insulin sensitivity factor, target range, and so on. And that prescription will then also come with an activation code. So the user, either via email or text message, will get an activation code. And after they download the app from the App Store and then enter their activation code and verify who they are, they'll be able to use Tidepool Loop. So let me stop there and see if you have any questions.
I have lots of questions. Of course, I have questions.
Yeah.
I have some specific questions about that, but my first question is there, and pardon my ignorance, are there other medical apps in the App Store that require prescription like that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a pretty rapidly growing field. I can think of a few examples. There's a company called Pear Therapeutics, for example, that makes prescription applications for addiction treatment, for insomnia, for example. There are a few prescription apps in the Diabetes space, WellDoc is well known for creating an app in the diabetes space that requires a prescription. So digital therapeutics, as they're known, or DTX, that's a pretty rapidly evolving field where there's a whole new wave of digital health applications that aren't just general health and wellness applications. They're actually software that you need a prescription for.
That's really cool. So you get your code, you put it in, and as you said, basal rates, carb ratios, all the pump settings are already preloaded by your doctor.
That's exactly right.
Okay. For some reason,
And
go ahead.
well, I was just going to say, we, in working with the FDA, felt it was important that at least the initial set of settings is something that you collaborate with your healthcare provider on. And so the healthcare provider goes to our prescription portal, will provide some general guidelines. We start with the ADA guidelines based on total daily dose and weight and things like that. And then the healthcare provider will be able to come up with the initial set of settings and issue the prescription to the person living with diabetes.
Many people use DIY technology because of the flexibility. When we last talked, it was about it was after submission, but a while ago. You couldn't really talk too much about the parameters that were going to
Yeah.
happen here. Can you speak to that at all now in terms of how much flexibility people will have with target ranges and things like that?
I absolutely can. Now that we are an officially FDA cleared device, I can actually say what was cleared. And I can tell you that the FDA did accept our verification and validation data and clinical evidence that would allow Tidepool Loop to have a flexible target range that can be set as low as 87 milligrams per deciliter and as high as 180 milligrams per deciliter. So we're pretty excited about this. A lot of the existing systems have far more tightly constrained parameters. So what this is going to do is allow people living with diabetes and their healthcare providers to come up with the settings that are best for them, given their current life situation.
I have so many questions. Okay, the first one is, when the doctor writes that prescription, can the doctor dictate what that low or high range is set to? Or once the person gets it in their hands, they can adjust it?
So both.
Oh,
As part of the prescription process, the doctor enters the initial set of settings. Those become part of the bundle of settings that get delivered to Tidepool Loop when the app is authorized using that prescription code. So the doctor creates the initial settings, but then the user, the person living with diabetes, can review the settings and say, yep, still looks great. And I'm going to go with what my doctor suggested. Or they can go in and make changes. As we all know, diabetes is a self-managed disease. People change their settings all the time on current insulin pumps, both open loop and closed loop systems. And we felt that it was really important to empower the person living with diabetes to make those changes on their own after they receive that initial set of settings from their healthcare provider.
why 87?
Well, that is the number after we did the analysis of the data, that there was a pretty obvious, clear point where 87 struck the balance between flexibility, but also safety. So I think over time, we may see changes to that, but based on the clinical data that we analyzed, along with our partners at the Jape Center for Health Research, 87 seemed like the right place to draw that line for now.
Everything. Well, I could get in the weeds, and I will try not to dwell too much on too many details because I know people have lots and lots of questions. So, with the time that we have, talk a little bit, if you could, about the system itself, because this is not a system that comes in a box. As you said, you get the app, but there are other components, the actual hardware. As I read the release, it is going to work with Dexcom. Can you talk about pump companies? When we last spoke, there were agreements in place. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself there, but what pumps will this work with?
Yeah, it's a great question. So yes, indeed, Dexcom continues to be a wonderful partner for us, and they are continue to be a development partner for Tidepool Loop. And the data that we submitted was all based on using the Dexcom G6 as a CGM, and specifically as an iCGM, which is an integrated continuous glucose monitor, which is part of this interoperable system. As far as our pump partners go, it's a really wonderful question. If you remember back to 2018, 2019, we announced that both Insulat and Medtronic were development partners for us with Tidepool and Tidepool Loop. And we're super incredibly grateful to them because both Insulat and Medtronic did help fund the development of Tidepool Loop. Those two companies have since decided from a commercial standpoint that providing compatible devices for Tidepool Loop is not part of their plans. We actually have published a blog post that goes into the details as provided from those companies. So unfortunately, at this point, neither Medtronic nor Insulet will be providing pumps that are compatible with Tidepool Loop. We do have other pump partners that we're working with. Unfortunately, we can't say who they are at this point. They're not quite ready to talk about their involvement. But what I can tell you is what we got cleared, what we worked through with the FDA, is we don't have to do another submission. So when there is a compatible ACE pump, and ACE stands for alternate controller enabled insulin infusion pump, when there is a compatible ACE pump that has demonstrated to the FDA through their submission that they are eligible to be controlled by a third-party controller like Tidepool Loop, we can make that ACE pump work with Tidepool Loop and put the update in the App Store without an additional submission through the FDA. Because what we did with the FDA is we came up with very specific plans and procedures. They're called SOPs, standard operating procedures, which are basically just big checklists of all the things we need to do to demonstrate that the device can work safely and securely and effectively with Tidepool Loop.
It's, I'm not trying to do a gotcha here, Howard, by any stretch of the imagination. But I have to ask, there's only one ACE pump that I know of approved in the United States, and that's the Tandem t:slim X2. I know you cannot speak to the pump companies. Are there other ACE pumps that I am missing in the United States?
Insulet, actually, also the Omnipod Dash and the Omnipod 5 have both been cleared.
Oh, I'm
as
sorry. I
ACE
meant
pumps.
that you hadn't. I meant that you had still potential partners
Sorry.
with. I mean, of your remaining dance partners.
Yeah, there are other insulin pump developers, and again, unfortunately, I can't tell you who they are, that are working on third-party enabled ACE pumps, and they haven't yet announced their intention to do that, but once they do, we'll be able to talk to you about it.
Yeah. I can hear my listeners in my ear wanting me to ask this. And again, I know you cannot answer all of this, and you may not just want to, but I got to say, I think there are a lot of people who went, what? When they heard that Insulin was not going to partner with you, because they had been there pretty much from the beginning. And most people, if not all the people who use DIY Loop, use an Insulet product. Can I ask, are you any reaction to that? I assume you're disappointed.
Obviously, I would love it if Insulet provided an insulin pump that were eligible for third-party control and that they would continue to be a partner for Tidepool Loop. I think they have a great product in Omnipod 5. I can understand the decision that they made. At this point, I think my best bet would be to refer you to Insulat and also to the statement that they gave us, which you can read on our website.
You got it. And we will, of course, link up all of that so you can read the blog posts as well.
Super.
Speaking about those trials, though, when we last talked, you had mentioned that this was, I would call it, these are not your words, I would call it a non-traditional clinical trial or submission, in that you didn't do a new one. You didn't put the device, there's no device, you didn't put it on people and have them wear it and show it. You used all the data that was from real world people using the DIY Loop system, right? Can you share a little bit about that?
That's exactly right. And I think that's one of the amazing things about this journey and about the story of Tidepool Loop. And this was actually at the suggestion of the FDA. The FDA has made a really big push towards the utilization of what they call real world evidence, RWE. And back when it became very clear that the DIY Loop system had become very popular, the agency encouraged us to use that real world evidence from the DIY loopers. So we iterated both with our partners at the Jape Center for Health Research and with the FDA on what that protocol would look like. But at the end of the day, it was an observational study as opposed to an interventional study. an observational study of people using the do-it-yourself loop system. What's incredible about it is over 1,000 people were enrolled in the study. Over 850 people in the study contributed between 6 and 12 months worth of data. It's an enormous study. The amount of data in the loop observational study of DIY loop, if you total it all up and think of it in terms of person days looked at in the study, it's 3 times the amount of data compared to, at the time, the pivotal studies for Control-IQ, Basal-IQ, and the Medtronic 670G combined.
Wow.
So it was really an incredible amount of data. And what that allowed us to do was, whenever the FDA would ask a question, they would say, well, can you show us what this looks like in your pediatric patients where the data is constrained to the set points that you've proposed for Tidepool Loop? We had so much data that we could go back to our friends at the Jabe Center and say, hey, can you recut the data, reslice the data in this way so that we can demonstrate to the agency that this algorithm is safe and effective when used in this way? To me, it's really an incredible testament to the power of the community. I mean, people just stepped up. People in the community said, absolutely, I'm going to do all the work. Like, being in a study is a lot of work. You have to fill out a ton of surveys. You have to take at-home HbA1c tests. You have to respond to phone calls. You have to report all of your adverse events. Like, there's a lot of work that goes into being in the study. And over 1,000 people did that from the DIY community. And we're just so grateful to the effort that they put in that made this possible.
Yeah, that's huge. I had asked you about the settings for the range of Tidepool Loop.
Mhm.
Can you speak to the system itself in terms of, people who have used things like Control-IQ or Loop or Omnipod 5 are kind of getting used to how these automated systems work by adjusting basal or giving a bolus once an hour. Any detail that you can share with us on how it works?
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge white paper on our website that actually goes into all kinds of nerdy, gory detail on how the underlying algorithm works. What I'll tell you is, just from a person living with diabetes, if you're used to all of the traditional pump settings like basal rates, like insulin sensitivity factor, carb ratio, those are all still there. And so you work with your healthcare provider, figure out what the right settings are for you. There is one additional setting with Tidepool Loop known as a glucose safety limit. And that's basically the lower bound where you're saying to Loop, whatever you do as you're thinking about delivering me insulin, use this as a lower safety limit. So don't let my blood glucose go below that point. And that's the one additional setting that Tidepool Loop introduces. And we have lots of information that teach people and healthcare providers on how to work with that. In terms of using Loop on a day-to-day basis, this is one of the things that we hear that people really love about DIY Loop, which is the user experience. So you still give meal boluses. You can say, I'm ready to eat now. But with Tidepool Loop, like with DIY Loop, what you say is, here are the carbs that I'm ingesting. So I'm, say, having a sandwich, and I think it's 30 grams of carbs. But you also get to say, here's the food emoji that
Yeah.
I think most closely represents the carb absorption of the food I'm eating. And the 3 default emojis are lollipop, taco, and pizza. And if you've lived with diabetes for a while, you know that that's a good indication of rapid acting carbs, like the lollipop, or average acting carbs, like the taco, or very slow absorbing carbs due to the fat and protein, like the pizza. And so we think that's a really cool way of telling the system what you're eating. The other thing that is unique and nice about Loop is you can actually edit that after the fact. And we've heard from users of DIY Loop that this is great, for example, for parents of kids living with type 1. Sometimes you make your best guess, you put a sandwich in front of your kid, and then your kid decides to only eat half the sandwich. You can actually go in after the fact and edit the carb entry and say, turns out my kid only ate half of that sandwich. Instead of 30 grams of carbs, it's 15 grams of carbs. And Loop will then adapt. And then the final thing that we hear a lot from do-it-yourself loopers that they really like is the ability to use an Apple Watch to control your diabetes from your wrist. So the core four features of Loop, which are giving yourself a meal bolus, telling it pre-meal mode, seeing your blood sugar. You can do all of those core features directly from your Apple Watch if you're an Apple Watch user.
That's
And I
really
think
cool.
people really, really like to be able to manage their diabetes discreetly from their watch.
To be clear, many people are extremely familiar with what you've just talked about, but I think we're
Mhm.
going to a lot of new listeners on this episode as well. When you say the system can adapt to fewer carbs, that 30 example, child is dosed for
Mhm.
30 carbs, only eats 15, you're not magically removing that meal bolus, correct? They're adjusting the basal going forward. The system is adjusting the basal.
That's exactly right. So it does two things. One is it for the initial meal bolus, it actually dials back the amount of insulin a little bit and waits to see what happens. The other thing it does is exactly what you described, which it will pull back on the drip, drip, drip of basal insulin and take away insulin that it might have otherwise delivered.
That's one of those things that I think many pediatric endocrinologists understand, but many do not, is that your 3-year-old is not a predictable eater. And I know your
That
daughter
is
was
so
diagnosed a
true.
little older, but I can't tell you the
Yeah.
amount of times that I was like, what
Mhm.
do you mean you're not going to eat that? What do you mean you're not going to eat that?
You have to.
Oh my gosh. But we move on from there. Um, with the smartphone use with the Apple Watch, we kind of skipped over it. It's implied again, if people are not familiar with it, um, it's full functionality from an Apple phone, from an iPhone.
Absolutely. It is not required that you have an Apple Watch, but if you do, you get the additional experience of being able to control Loop from your wrist.
And no change, not yet Android or yes?
Not yet Android. We absolutely positively intend to port Tidepool Loop to Android. We're not there yet. As you know, the DIY Loop system was written for iPhone, so it was easier for us to start with iPhone as a platform. But we absolutely recognize that in order to reach the broadest population of people living with diabetes, we're going to have to port it to Android as well. And we definitely intend to do that. I can't say when that will be ready at this point.
Um, well, before I move on to that, oh, speaking of timelines that you probably can't mention, you mentioned the G6. The first question many people will ask you is, will this work with the G7? I assume you're going to be having conversations about that if you have not already.
We absolutely are having conversations about the Dexcom G7 with Dexcom. It was just recently cleared in the US, so this is all fresh new information. But one of the great things about the architecture of Tidepool Loop, it is intended to support multiple types of CGMs, whether from the same manufacturer or different manufacturers.
I already mentioned your daughter, Katie. We should say she was diagnosed in
Hi, Katie.
2011.
That's right.
um, and I'm guessing she's still in college. She's in her
She
late
is. She
20s.
is a
Okay,
senior at Cal and getting ready to graduate, and
awesome.
she is doing great. And we're super proud of her.
And I bring her up. You have 2 other children, but I bring her up because you have used Loop with her. She's been on the system. You've been very public about this for a while. I'm
Mhm.
curious, and I can ask you a little bit more about her if you don't mind, but I'm curious if when you
Sure.
look through those mountains of data, you've used the system in your family for quite a while. Did anything surprise you as you looked at the whole community use of it?
Well, I don't know if this was surprising, but it was notable to me that at the end of the day, I think what Katie wanted, and from what I hear from other people living with type 1, is it's actually just all about reducing the burden of
Mm.
managing the disease. And the thing that is most valuable to people isn't the features or the functionality or the time and range. It's let me get back to living my life as normally as I possibly can. And so I think this is true for all automated insulin delivery systems. The less you have to think about your diabetes, the better. The more you can just go about living your normal life, the better. And certainly with Katie, and I've heard this from all my other friends who live with type 1, that's the name of the game. And I think Loop does a very good job of that. And I think other automated systems also do a great job of that.
Yeah, it's very nice to see more and more choices since you and I
Yeah.
first talked. You know, I think the first time we talked for the podcast might have been way back 2016. I think I was looking that up. And as you listen, I will link up all of these episodes. It's fun to see the evolution of
Super.
these companies. I've been
Yeah.
doing the show since 2015. But Tidepool didn't start out as this kind of company at all. And it's not still, you do many other things. Can you speak a little bit about Tidepool's mission in terms of data? And I'm going to assume you're going to be continuing down that line.
Yeah, absolutely. Our mission is still the same, which is to make diabetes data more actionable, meaningful, and useful. And we've done that all along through our data management software. And we are still doing that. And as a matter of fact, use of our data management platform has grown dramatically. We saw a huge uptick through the pandemic when it was really important for people to be able to upload their data from home when they couldn't see their endocrinologist in person. And we're seeing an even more dramatic increase now. We started hearing from clinics over the years the kinds of features that they wanted to see in order to support population management and enterprise single sign-on and the ability to do remote patient management. And so we took all that feedback, and last summer in 2022 at the ADA conference, we launched what we're calling Tidepool Plus, which is a suite of functionality built on top of our original data management platform, but that is very specifically giving those clinics and clinic systems the kind of functionality that they've been asking for years and years and years. And that became really, really evident during the pandemic. That was going to be really important to them. So we're thrilled to announce that, we have well over 350,000 accounts within Tidepool now. We've been growing dramatically over the last 6 months. And our new Tidepool Plus functionality has been received really, really well by healthcare providers. We're still giving away the free tier of Tidepool's data management software that we've always had. And in addition, we now have a paid tier called Tidepool Plus. And the great thing about that is we're a not-for-profit. And our goal has always been to be a self-sustaining nonprofit. We'd love to not have to ask people for donations. We'd love to not have to ask the grant-making organizations to keep funding us. And so this Tidepool Plus tier allows us to move towards that goal of being a self-sustaining nonprofit.
This is a delicate question, but I will ask it anyway. You brought up being a nonprofit, and you have asked folks for money, like nonprofits do. You've raised funds.
Sure.
I mentioned, talking to you in 2016, and we've both been around the community for a very long time. And there were so many, I don't want to call them pie in the sky ideas, but lots of high reaching ideas from the DIY community back in the 2011, 12, 13, 14, all that time. A lot of people went into industry and went in some different directions. Some projects have panned out, some have not, some have kind of shifted lanes and adapted. And I know a lot of people, frankly, have been really rooting for Tidepool, but have also been really worried about Tidepool. So I guess the question in all that is, I'm sure you have had a lot of nights when you've been up worried as well. Can you take a bigger breath now? I mean, this FDA approval is big as where we sit in the community, not just for the significance, like, wow, this is the first DIY thing that really, look, they got it through, but also, oof, Tidepool is going to catch a break.
I can definitely take a breath, but we're not done yet. There's so much more to do. I will feel really good when we can actually get Tidepool Loop into the App Store and can announce our other device partners. It'll feel really good when we see Tidepool Plus deployed even more broadly than it is now. So we're not out of the woods yet. I would love to move to Europe. I would love to make sure, and the rest of the world, and make sure that our software can find the broadest possible audience. And I'd love to do a lot more work to make sure that people who typically don't have access to devices and systems, both in the US and internationally, can get access to the best possible care. I won't feel like our work is done until every single person living with diabetes has access to the best possible devices and technology to help them live the least burdensome and safest and healthiest life they can.
As we start to wrap up, just a couple of little questions here. You mentioned outside of
Sure.
United States, that's a goal, but you're not really ready to talk about any kind of timeline there or any other partners internationally?
We are not yet officially supported outside of the US. We do know that our data management platform is used outside of the US. We're very popular in certain parts of Europe and in Israel, for example. We don't claim that we meet local data privacy laws,
Hmm.
although we are GDPR compliant and we do meet US HIPAA laws. So it is a secure and private and safe system, but every country's got its own quirky data privacy laws, and we haven't gone country to country yet to make sure that we comply with them all. So nothing formal or official to announce, either with the data management platform or with Tidepool Loop when it comes to international use. I will just tell you that we're a tiny little team and we're paddling as fast as we can to get all of the great work we do out there. And it's really important to us that everything we do gets used by as many people as possible.
Tidepools also unique in how open it is about everything. If you haven't, as you listen, if you haven't gone to the website, if you haven't looked through the documentation, you may be really surprised what they make public. And I asked you this right after you submitted. I'll ask it again. Are you happy that you went down that road?
I'm really happy that we went down that road. It's a really, for me, a wonderful way to build products and to run a company. I like being a not for profit. I like being open source. I like being radically transparent about everything we do, because at the end of the day, what it means is that all of the decisions we can make asking ourselves the question, what is the best thing for the diabetes community? Now, do I want to make sure we get to becoming a financially self-sustainable nonprofit? Absolutely, positively. And I think we're well on our way to that with the launch of Tidepool Plus and now with the clearance of Tidepool Loop. But making everything we do available openly, that's part of our mission. And it brings me such joy. I hear several times per year from a new med tech startup that says, "Hey, thank you very much. We adopted your quality management system and it became the source of our products." And it makes me so happy when I hear about companies like Stenopool that in Europe that use our software to deliver healthcare within their country, and there are hospitals in Germany and Brazil that use our open source code to deliver better care. So to me, that's just part of being good members of the diabetes community, and being radically transparent helps us share all the learnings we've had with the rest of the community, and hopefully do the best good that we can do.
I have two more questions. I know I'm going to keep you here for time, but
Go for it.
thank you. I would be remiss to not ask you about, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about pricing. How does this get paid for? Do I go in the app store and Apple charges me? Does my healthcare insurance come into play? How does that work?
So we haven't yet publicly talked about what pricing will look like for Tidepool Loop. That's something we're going to work out with the device maker partners that
Got
we
it.
launch with. It's possible that there may be some cost to the consumer. We hope that'll be minimal. It's possible that it will be subsidized by the device maker partners. And it's also possible that over time we'll be able to get reimbursement through health insurance policies. That's going to take years to play out, but we're working through all of those things, because again, what we really want is for the broadest possible population to have access to our technology.
And then my last question really is, Howard, we mentioned your daughter being diagnosed with diabetes in 2011. If you think back to that time, did you ever think something like this would be what you did? I mean, our children are diagnosed and we get pulled in a direction that suits our talent, I guess. But I never thought I'd be doing a podcast when Benny was diagnosed at age 2. I mean, did this kind of go
Yeah.
through your head? Like, I'll use what I know?
Well, I think every parent just wants the best for their kid, and every parent, when your kid is diagnosed with something crazy like type 1 diabetes, asks themselves the question, what can I do? Is there anything that I can do? I just happen to have the skill set of running organizations that build software. I knew nothing about healthcare. I knew nothing about medical devices. Frankly, I didn't even know there are different kinds of diabetes when Katie was diagnosed, and so that was all learning for me. but and I'm sure you experience this as well. We get drawn to the area where we think we can make the biggest difference and help our kid. And at the end of the day, I'm thrilled that what we've ended up building is helpful to people like Benny and Katie who live with type 1 diabetes, and lots of other people will eventually over time expand into other broadening of what we do into, for example, type 2 diabetes. And I think that that's a great thing, and I'm very proud of the team that I work with and very happy that we've been able to use our talents to do a little good in the world.
That's great. Well, Howard, I really appreciate you jumping on with me so quickly, just really a couple of days after the approval. And thanks for sharing so much information. I'm sure we'll have many more questions, so we'll circle back in the weeks to come.
It's always a pleasure to talk to you, Stacey. Thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.